Stateville Correctional Center, Illinois' Panopticon prison psychology. For nearly a century, one prison in America has tested a question most facilities never dared to ask. What happens to the human mind when you're watched every second, even when no one is actually watching? Welcome to Stateville Correctional Center, Illinois' massive, circular experiment in total visibility. A place where the architecture isn't just walls and steel, it's a psychological weapon. Inside these concrete rings, inmates learned early that privacy was an illusion. Every movement, every conversation, every emotion carried the weight of unseen eyes. Some adapted, some broke, others turned the design against the system itself. Today, we step into the only American prison built as a functioning panopticon. Not as theory, but as everyday reality. And the stories buried inside Stateville reveal how surveillance can shape a person's behavior long before a guard ever says a word. This documentary contains descriptions of prison conditions and violence for educational purposes based on verified sources. Viewer discretion is advised. For more deep research of prison documentary like this, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Stateville Correctional Center was never meant to feel like a normal prison. When Illinois opened it in 1925, the state embraced a radical architectural idea imported directly from European penal philosophy: build a prison where a single guard could theoretically observe hundreds of inmates at once, simply by standing in the center. That idea became the Panopticon, a circular structure built on psychological pressure rather than physical force. Inside Stateville's massive roundhouse, cells stretched around the perimeter like spokes on a wheel. Inmates could see the watchtower at the center, but they could never see the guard inside it. The uncertainty was the point. It forced prisoners to internalize surveillance, to self-regulate, to live with the constant question: is someone watching me right now? For decades, this design shaped everything from inmate behavior to social hierarchies. Interactions shifted. Trust eroded. Even silence carried new meaning. And while guards relied on the architecture for control, inmates found their own ways to interpret, and sometimes resist, the psychological pressure the building created. But behind these stone walls and steel catwalks, Stateville became more than a prison. It became a living experiment in how environment alters the human mind. And in the chapters ahead, we break down how surveillance, history, real inmate experiences, and the institution's evolution created one of the most studied and most controversial prisons in the country. Inside Stateville's Panopticon. Stepping inside Stateville's roundhouse was like entering a machine built to break down privacy itself. The space echoed differently from other prisons. Every sound curved, bounced, and returned. Even whispers felt exposed. Inmates described their first moments in the roundhouse the same way: a mix of disorientation and pressure. Not from guards barking orders, but from the architecture staring back at them. Cells stacked 5 tiers high formed a perfect circle, each one facing the central tower. No corners. No shadows. No place where you could mentally step away. Even men who had survived other maximum security facilities said Stateville felt different, not harder, but stranger. As if the building itself was the one watching. Former inmates interviewed by state researchers explained how this shaped daily behavior. Some limited their movements, avoiding anything that could be misread. Others communicated in subtle signals instead of words, knowing that even casual conversations felt monitored. A few developed routines that gave them a sense of control, reinforcing order in a place where unpredictability lived in the architecture. Corrections staff reported the same thing from the other side. The Panopticon changed how officers interacted with prisoners. It demanded confidence, but also caution. One guard described the tower as a stage with no script, where the power of being unseen came with the pressure of being everywhere at once. Over time, both inmates and staff learned something surprising. The psychological weight didn't come from actual surveillance. It came from the possibility of it. And that possibility never turned off. The Panopticon design. Stateville's layout was more than an architectural choice. It was a philosophy built into concrete. Inspired by Jeremy Bentham's 18th century vision, Illinois adapted the Panopticon concept on a scale no American prison had attempted. From the outside, the roundhouse looked like a fortress. But once inside, the design revealed its purpose: visibility over force, psychology over manpower. Every cell faced inward toward a central guard tower built with narrow slits instead of open windows. Inmates could never tell if anyone was inside. That uncertainty became the true mechanism of control. Prison documentation from the Illinois Department of Corrections described the roundhouse as an observation-driven environment. But in practice, it became something more complex. A place where the architecture blurred the line between security and stress. The circular shape eliminated blind spots, but it also amplified tension. The lighting hit the cells in the same pattern day after day. The constant vertical stacking, 5 tiers of steel, created a sense of being trapped not just horizontally, but upward and downward too. Men talked about how the design made them feel compressed, even when they weren't physically restricted. Criminologists studying Stateville noted that inmates often changed their behavior simply because they believed they were being watched, cleaning their cell more carefully, limiting conversations, even adjusting how they moved. Over time, this wasn't obedience. It was adaptation to an environment built around invisible oversight. And yet, the same design that promised efficiency created its own problems. Noise traveled in circles. Heat trapped itself in the upper tiers. Stress built silently in the routines shaped by the structure. What looked like order from the tower often hid the mental burden carried by the people living inside the ring. Psychology of constant surveillance. Living in Stateville's Panopticon wasn't just a physical experience. It reshaped the mind in ways inmates often didn't recognize until years later. Researchers found that the fear of unseen observation created a type of internal tension unique to this facility. Men spoke about developing habits they didn't have in other prisons. Checking their posture, lowering their voices, keeping emotions flat, even when they were alone in their cells. The possibility of a guard's eyes, real or imagined, pushed many into constant self-monitoring. Some inmates said the roundhouse made them feel like they were on display, as if every moment was being assessed. That feeling didn't always lead to compliance. For a few, it sparked withdrawal. They spoke less. They moved less. They trusted less. Others reacted differently, becoming hyper-alert, scanning tiers and walkways out of instinct, even when they knew the tower windows were opaque. Mental health staff in Illinois noted a pattern. Inmates in surveillance-heavy environments sometimes developed symptoms linked to chronic stress, restlessness, irritability, difficulty sleeping. None of these reactions were dramatic, but they built slowly over time, shaped by a design meant to influence behavior without force. Yet not everyone responded the same way. Some men found ways to reclaim small pieces of psychological freedom. They created private mental routines, focused on reading or writing, or developed personal rules that helped them feel grounded. A few said that understanding the structure, knowing when shadows shifted, when sounds echoed differently, gave them a sense of control inside a system built to take that control away. But the roundhouse never let them forget its presence. Even on quiet days, inmates described a subtle pressure, like a weight that lived in the air. A reminder that in Stateville, the architecture wasn't just something they lived inside, it was something living inside them. History of Stateville. When Stateville Correctional Center opened in 1925, Illinois wasn't just building another maximum security prison. It was attempting a social experiment. At the time, reformers believed architecture could shape behavior, and the Panopticon offered a modern, efficient solution. One guard, hundreds of inmates, and discipline achieved through design, not confrontation. Early reports described Stateville as a model of innovation. The circular roundhouse was celebrated as a breakthrough, an American adaptation of a European theory that promised order through visibility. But as the decades passed, the idealism faded, replaced by the realities of overcrowding, underfunding, and the psychological strain the structure imposed on both staff and prisoners. By the 1940s and 1950s, Stateville's reputation had shifted. The roundhouse was no longer seen as progressive but as a relic with mounting challenges. Heat in the upper tiers became unbearable in the summer. Winters turned the steel into a freezing echo chamber. Guards reported that the layout made communication difficult. Inmates said the design magnified tension. Despite these issues, the facility remained central to Illinois' correctional system. Through the 1970s and 1980s, Stateville housed some of the state's most high-profile offenders, and the roundhouse became symbolic, an image tied to toughness, endurance, and the psychological impact of confinement. Reforms came slowly. New housing units were added. Mental health services increased. But the original roundhouse never stopped defining Stateville's identity. Even as modern prisons adopted different layouts, Stateville stood as a living timeline, a window into how ideas about punishment, control, and rehabilitation evolved across generations. When the roundhouse finally closed in recent years, it wasn't because the building collapsed or lost its function. It was because society had changed. Researchers, staff, and state officials recognized that architecture carries consequences, not just for safety, but for the mind. Yet for almost a century, the roundhouse shaped lives, decisions, and history within Illinois' correctional system. And the stories that emerged from inside those walls reveal how powerful and how complicated architectural psychology can be. Famous inmates and escapes. Stateville's history isn't defined only by its architecture, it's shaped by the people who lived within it. Over the decades, the prison held some of Illinois' most well-known offenders, and each arrival added another layer to the institution's identity. Among them were men whose cases drew national attention, creating a spotlight the roundhouse was never built for. Their presence turned ordinary routines into high-tension days. Staff had to navigate media pressure, legal teams, and heightened security concerns, all while operating inside a structure that already demanded constant vigilance. Inmates who shared tiers with high-profile prisoners often described a strange mix of curiosity and unease. Even without physical contact, reputations carried weight. Some men kept their distance. Others observed quietly, trying to understand how those individuals handled the psychological strain of Stateville's design. For some, fame seemed irrelevant compared to the mental pressure of the Panopticon. For others, it intensified it. Despite the prison's reputation for tight control, Stateville also faced escape attempts, rare, but deeply studied. These attempts weren't feats of cinematic action. They were calculated responses to the prison's unique environment. Investigative records show that most plans relied on timing and observation rather than force. Those involved tried to exploit the same surveillance system that constrained them, studying patterns, shadows, and routines. The most notable attempts often failed not because of guards, but because the structure itself made secrecy nearly impossible. Conversations carried. Movements echoed. The design, built to keep people visible, worked as intended. Still, each attempt revealed something about the human response to confinement, the desire for control, the need for autonomy, and the lengths people will go when pushed by pressure, psychological, environmental, or both. These stories don't glamorize wrongdoing. They highlight the complex reality inside a facility where every action, from the smallest conversation to the boldest plan, was shaped by a building that watched without blinking. Modern-day operations. Today, Stateville Correctional Center looks very different from the institution that opened a century ago. The roundhouse, the iconic Panopticon, has closed, sealed off as both a historical artifact and a reminder of how dramatically correctional philosophy has changed. But the rest of the facility remains active, housing hundreds of men under maximum security conditions. Modern operations focus less on architectural control and more on structured management. Staff rely on surveillance cameras, controlled movement schedules, and updated training rather than a central tower designed to manipulate behavior through uncertainty. Mental health services have expanded, with clinicians addressing the long-term impact of incarceration, especially for men who lived years in the roundhouse's psychological pressure. Inmates who experienced both eras often describe a clear difference. The newer units still enforce strict rules, but they remove the sensation of being observed from every angle. Privacy remains limited, but the constant internal tension, the sense that every action might be monitored even when no guard was present, has eased. Administrators emphasize rehabilitative programming, literacy courses, and controlled job assignments. These changes don't erase the institution's challenges, but they shift the focus toward stability rather than architectural dominance. Officers report that communication is clearer, stress is lower, and movement is more predictable. Yet even with these updates, the legacy of Stateville's Panopticon lingers. Former roundhouse inmates carry memories shaped by a design that dictated their daily existence. Criminologists still study the psychological impact of that structure, using Stateville as a case study in how architecture can influence behavior for better or for worse. Stateville today stands at a crossroads between its past and its future, a functioning maximum security prison, but also a symbol of how ideas about surveillance, control, and human dignity have evolved within the American correctional system. Stateville Correctional Center is more than a prison. It's a window into the human mind under pressure. Its circular walls, its watchtower, and its design weren't just about security, they were about shaping behavior, controlling perception, and testing the boundaries of what constant observation does to a person. The stories of the men who lived inside, the tension they endured, and the adaptations they made reveal a truth that goes beyond Illinois. Architecture can change us in ways we barely notice, even when freedom feels just out of reach. From historic escapes to mental strain, from the famous inmates to the quiet routines of everyday life, Stateville's Panopticon offers a lesson in how environment and psychology are inseparable, and how power can sometimes be exercised without a single word. If this journey into the mind and design of Stateville fascinated you, there's so much more to explore. Subscribe now for deep dives into prison architecture, inmate psychology, and the hidden systems shaping lives behind bars. Turn on notifications so you never miss the next story of how the walls around us influence the way we think, act, and survive. Because behind every steel door, there's more than punishment, there's a story waiting to be understood.